Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Nostalgia Trap. I am your host, David Parsons. I am ready to bring you another great conversation. You know, we've been talking a lot on the show lately about the weird left insurgency that's happening and what we do with it, what we're supposed to think about it, particularly the victory of Alexandria Ocasio Cortez in New York City, being this kind of mind-blowing moment where all of us are kind of scratching our heads and thinking, is this the beginning of something important? And how do we contain this moment? How do we grow it? How do we build it? How do we stop the Democrats from swallowing it whole like they've done with so much radical energy in the past? So my guest today has a lot to say about that topic. Her name is Alex Press. She is an assistant editor at Jacobin Magazine. You can find her writing all over the place. She's been in The Nation, Vox, Washington Post, all sorts of places. And you know, I follow her Twitter feed. She's got a really great, very funny, and very informative Twitter feed. So check her out at Alex N Press. But this conversation, you know, we started off talking about Ocasio Cortez, and we kind of went all over the place. And I wanted to hear about, you know, her background and how she came to the left. But I hope you enjoy it. It's a very typical, very I think characteristic Nostalgia Trap conversation in which we kind of mix the politics with the biography. So I hope you enjoy this. And if you are able to support the show, you can do that. You can go to nostalgiatrap.com. All the episodes are in there, and we have a Patreon. It's the only way that we make money on this show is through our Patreon. So patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And you can subscribe and get bonus episodes. And speaking of that, we've got a great bonus episode up this week. That's me and frequent Nostalgia Trap master guest Justin Rogers Cooper, who, if you haven't got to know him yet, you should, because he's such a great voice for the show, and I think that, you know, we'll have a lot more of him. But this conversation for this week, the bonus episode, is about Kanye and Kanye wearing the "Make America Great Again" hat and what we're supposed to do with that, and how Trump intersects with the wider history of hip hop, and what that tells us about the kinds of people, especially men, that ascend through capitalism. So Justin has a whole lot of really mind-blowing thoughts about that, only for subscribers. So if you want to listen to that episode, go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. It is up right now. Check out our thoughts on Trump. Check out the thoughts of two white dudes on Trump and hip-hop. Okay, so let's get to the episode today. This is Alex Press. I think that I had a really great conversation with her, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. So this is me talking with Jacobin editor and writer and extraordinary leftist Twitter person, Alex Press. I feel like it's a busy summer to be a democratic socialist. I feel like this is the moment where a lot of these ideas are bursting into the mainstream. The View, just, I think it was it yesterday that The View had the girls, the women on The View were talking about socialism, and Meghan McCain had a meltdown about it. Does it feel weird?
Yes.
Does it feel weird to like be someone who was kind of working on these ideas in the background, to see them like burst into the mainstream this way?
It is incredibly weird. I mean, for lots of us, maybe yourself included, I don't know, you know, your political history, but I'm very used to spending all of my time in church basements with the same 20 people at every meeting.
Right.
And that is what my adult life has been.
Yep.
I mean, that and working has pretty much been it. So it is very weird. You know, of course, it feels like there are higher stakes, you know, we're really, the debates we're having, you know, they matter.
Right.
And so in that sense, it's a bit stressful, but I mean, taking a step back, it's sort of like a dream come true, you know?
Yeah.
You're like, I just assumed that this would be, you know, not that we all didn't want growth. It's just, it's been a while since that really happened. So, so it's very weird to constantly, I mean, even the novelty is worn off, right? Like every day, seemingly, you know, the thing like The View, it's every day at this point, there seems to be a lot of media attention, and, you know, at a certain point you don't even have time to watch these videos or read these articles because you're very busy doing the work to keep them, you know.
Right.
Happening.
Yeah, it's weird. Yeah, discovering that. I mean, I feel like a lot of Americans are discovering that there's something further left than liberal for like the first time in their lives, which is,
I hope so.
Which is not their fault. I mean, they've been like kind of lied to for years and years about it.
Sure. I mean, that history has been lost, and so it's on people like myself to, you know, use the moment to spread that language and get that history back in the mainstream. I mean, there's an opening at the moment that is why a lot of us are working 400 hours a week to take advantage of it.
So wait, what are you working 400 hours a week on? What are you doing? I know you're a writer, and I follow your Twitter, and I love your politics, and I love pretty much everything you put up there. But at the same time, I'm kind of wondering, what is it you do? What are your
Sure.
I know you write for Jacobin. You're an editor at Jacobin, right?
So I'm an editor at Jacobin. So I pretty much do not write for Jacobin. I edit.
Right.
And so I think I've written one thing for Jacobin in the past year or so that I've been on staff there.
Mm-hmm.
And then I freelance elsewhere. And beyond that, so Jacobin is a union workplace.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the chair for our union. So that puts me on the executive board at the News Guild, which, media unions are a weird thing compared to certain, I don't know. I mean, not to dismiss how much that stuff matters, but also they're strategic sectors and they are not media.
Right.
That said, I'm of the view that one organizes where one is. And so, for all those caveats, the News Guild keeps having new units join it pretty regularly now. It's a pretty exciting time if you're a lefty in media. So that, that's takes some time. And then beyond that, there's DSA, which in New York is, becoming very quickly a very serious force. I mean, it's almost unwieldy. There are thousands of members.
Did you expect, and we can go back and we can see if this is true via Twitter and stuff, but did you expect the victory of Alexandra Ocasio Cortez? Because that's something that pretty much no one expected. And how was the DSA? I know was endorsing her and helping, but did you think it was an impossible victory, or did you have a feeling that there was something stirring in Brooklyn?
So, to be completely honest with you, I'm not particularly active with the electoral campaigns that DSA is involved with, either within New York City or nationally, which, is part of in certain ways, the benefit of a thing like DSA is that there's so much happening, and it's not a, democratic centralist organization. So one can focus on certain campaigns and, leave the rest to your trusted comrades. That said, so not having been in the middle of that campaign, I certainly, my passing familiarity with it was that she didn't have a shot, just like a lot of people thought. And again, that speaks to the fact that even if you're completely embedded within the left or within DSA, the effect of what's seen as possible electorally is very strong, right? So you kind of just generally trust what news is telling you about how these campaigns work and what it takes to win. Yes, so I very much remember it was election day, and it's I should go to, see the results at her headquarters and all of that. And I was like, well, I'm very busy and I just don't think she's going to win. And, and of course, then completely, hitting my head against the wall, oh God, I had no idea. But that is just me. So lots of people I've spoken to within DSA felt completely the opposite. They said if all it took was one shift as a canvasser and you saw that her opponent it was a completely hollow campaign on his part, and the energy was completely with Alexandria Ocasio Cortez. I think if you ask someone who had been a part of that campaign, even if they aren't in DSA, anyone who was involved with the infrastructure or the canvassing, they seem like they felt very confident going into it.
I saw that. I felt that on social media, watching in the days leading up to the election. It felt like the people that were working on her campaign were reporting this kind of excitement on the streets. But it's hard being on the left. It's hard balancing your hope that everyone in the world, and especially the working class, are on your side, with your cynicism and pessimism about and protection from feeling the sadness of losing again and again. It's hard to.
Sure.
I find that hard to balance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that said, the question of, because we constantly say this, right? This is part of what certainly anybody who has any kind of public facing role for the left is that we're constantly claiming that the working class can be won to these ideas and blah, blah, blah. But the key there is that they have to be won to it. Mm-hmm. So we recognize that, especially in this country, because of, whether it's economic policies, media narratives, all of this stuff, actual decline of unions, most people aren't naturally going to be born socialists at this point, right? They've
Right.
never heard the language of class. They've never encountered, whether it's a union or any other organized political force, telling them that there's an alternative to Democratic Party liberalism or, conservatism. So that doesn't happen naturally. And I think that's why a lot of us, get very cynical, because it seems like the amount of, resources and people it would take to reach everyone is just overwhelming.
Yeah.
But I think what we're seeing in this moment that's exciting is actually we can do it, and we can win people. And I think that's part of the power of Ocasio Cortez's win, is seeing in practice that this stuff is not impossible, that we aren't marginal in the same way maybe even some of us thought of ourselves as, and that all it takes is often a very short conversation. And people want to be won. I mean, I'm sure you have that experience, and I do as well. As soon as you get into conversations with people about politics who are not leftists or not active politically, usually they, my experience at least is it doesn't take a whole lot. I mean, these are popular messages, and that's part of, that's why we're on the left, right? Is we actually are for the majority. And so, of course, the majority does respond to that language.
Yeah. And it's kind of, it depends. I mean, obviously it depends on who you're talking to.
Of course.
But yeah, you're right. I think there's always an underlying, I'm always surprised actually, by the kind of like, underlying leftism that's kind of inside a lot of Americans once you start talking to them. I wanted to ask you a little bit about like kind of how you were won over to the left, like kind of how, because I like to find out a little bit about how these ideas came to you. Some people on the show are like red diaper babies. They were raised by communist professors, so it's not much of a mystery why they ended up the way they are. But what
I
about...
so envy those people. Like a shortcut.
Right. Or sometimes it goes the other way though. I feel like sometimes those are the people that are like the most reactionary.
Yes, that's true. The rebellion that transforms into a lifelong career or something.
Right. I mean, there were a lot of conservatives in the town I come from, and also a lot of hippies. And like the young conservatives, the parents are often hippies, and it's like this like rebellion, weird inverse rebellion thing.
And what town are you from?
Oh, so I'm in Ventura, California, which is just north of Los Angeles. It's like a small little surf community, but it's also it's a weird mix because it's like there are a lot of Republicans here and there are a lot of Trump people here, but then there's also this kind of like liberal new age kind of hippie thing going on. So that and then the heart of the working class here are like Latino agricultural workers. So that you throw that in the mix, it's kind of like there's a lot to navigate. But I wanted to ask you like where you're from and what were you navigating when you were kind of coming to politics?
So I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is, in my opinion, the most underrated city in America.
I think a lot of people agree with you on that.
Yeah, and has incredible history if you're interested in left politics and unionism. But I was completely uninterested in politics and apolitical until Occupy. And so I was a student, an undergraduate in Boston. And I remember distinctly, occasionally reading a couple articles about Occupy Wall Street. And I was studying international relations, which at Boston University, where I went, is a pipeline to the State Department. So everybody who does well in that program will either generally go into the State Department, or if they're the like liberal version, they'll go into a nonprofit or NGO. And so even though in theory I was studying politics all day, that is what I was doing, I had really no interest in domestic politics or actual participation in something beyond, the state. So I remember a friend who I had met through some, a class or something, told me that he wanted to go down to visit Occupy Boston, which had just started. And I had read one or two very dismissive articles of the Occupy Wall Street movement from whatever mainstream source, that it was a bunch of hippies and it was very weird and people were sleeping in the streets. And I was 19, and so I was like, this doesn't sound particularly cool to me. And so my friend at the time, who was a BU undergrad, said, just come with me. It's just it's one train away. We'll go and we'll visit. It'll be fun. Just see what it's like. And so I agreed to go with him. And I remember we entered the camp and we both sort of agreed to just explore on our own and stuff. And within maybe half an hour, I was in a conversation with someone who was completely, just excited, had sort of drank the Kool-Aid in a way of how important this movement is. And it was a conversation I'd never had before. Complete stranger. I forget why we'd even started speaking, but I just asked her what was going on here and what the point of the occupation was. And I remember the friend coming and finding me maybe an hour later to leave.
Mm-hmm.
And I told him, like, no, I'm going to stay. And so he was like, okay, and takes the train back to BU. And that was pretty much it. And the left has been pretty much, what I do with my life ever since.
That's incredible. It's like a movie scene. I was like,
yes.
It was like Forrest Gump and Jenny going to the protest in Washington.
It is quite like that. And I'm happy to say that the follow-up scene to that is, of course, I get very involved in the Occupy Wall Street movement. And in Boston, a huge part of that was the universities. And so we started, me and that friend who actually remained very engaged with that movement as well, helped, be the nucleus of what we called Students Occupy Boston. And I remember we were going around to the dozens of university campuses, both the public schools and the private universities, and organizing, people on the campuses to then organize across the city. And I distinctly remember us calling our first march. That was going to be a, Students Occupy Boston. We marched from each of our campuses to the occupation. And, there's some demands around, cost of living, student loans, issues we're having on our campuses. And we're all, even though we had a core at every campus, and it was clear that, looking back, it was amazing how many people we had involved. I so envy that in the years after. And we called a march, and we wondered if anyone would come. And I remember we met at the Boston Common downtown in the rotunda, kind of where most marches in Boston end up either meeting or ending. And we just see each contingent from each campus showing up, one by one. And I think the march ended up being 15,000 people.
Wow.
And it was just completely, we all looked at each other, the, core that had planned the whole thing. Like, what the hell have we gotten ourselves into?
What forces have we unleashed?
Yeah. So it's kind of amazing to think back on, like, oh God, I had no idea what I was doing. None of us did. We're all teenagers with no experience on the left. Some actually did have experience. We're organized socialists. But generally, yeah, it was just a moment where there was a lot of energy.
Yeah, I think that's always true. I study like the anti-war movement and the left during the 1960s, and like it was all a bunch of young people who were like learning as they were going, and that's part of what explains how like chaotic it was, and like that chaos, and that I guess dialectic is what like moves history. But it's so funny to think of you like so rapidly radicalizing from like apolitical to going to the Occupy marches.
Yeah, it was very hard to explain to friends what had gotten into me, for sure, and family. But I think one thing that's important to explain, this is true for radicals, across generations, decades, whatever, around the world, is I think a lot of us are very used to the idea that we have nothing to offer. Mm-hmm. I was a teenage girl, not from a rich background. The idea that anyone would listen to me or I could contribute in some way was just completely had never entered my mind. And I think that's why people who enter these movements really young tend to stick with them, because there's no feeling like being told that you have something to offer when the world around you has never said that to you.
Yeah.
And so I think that I found that to be the case. And I think a lot of young radicals who end up staying around the left, it's that powerful feeling of like, recognition of you as a, someone who could be a leader.
Yeah. And it's energizing. Yeah. That's the opening, I think, of that really effective ad from the Ocasio Cortez campaign, which was something along the lines, like opening line was something like, people like me aren't supposed to run for office or something like that.
Yeah.
It's like, and when she says that, she doesn't have to say anything else. You kind of get that she's talking about youth, she's talking about gender, she's talking about race, she's talking about class,
exactly,
and all of that together. So like, yeah, that feeling that you can do something. What were you? So if you were apolitical before, because my radicalization took a long time. It was like lots of stages. It was like through 9/11 and all that kind of stuff. But like,
sure.
But if I were thinking like my life before politics, I was kind of like into like, I don't know, listening to like ska music and like stuff like that. Like, what were you before? What was, if you say like apolitical, heading towards the State Department and maybe becoming like Jason Bourne or something like that? Like how would you describe yourself?
I mean, I had like vaguely bohemian kind of leanings. My parents met in a punk band in New York, and I was and my dad's a street poet. So I was raised around, their politics aren't even straightforwardly liberal. My mom has like very bizarre kind of, it's unclear what her politics, were growing up at least.
Yeah.
But there was at least this kind of like milieu that I was raised around of, I thought maybe I could be a writer. Mm-hmm. All those were dreams that I never really was acting on by the time I got to college. I'd sort of given up on that idea. But there was a general openness to that stuff. So, I mean, as far as what I was, I was kind of a punk, kind of a bohemian type, whatever, but none of that necessarily connected to politics particularly.
Yeah. I think for a long time people thought that those kinds of things did connect to politics, and I think sometimes there is, but like with the rise of the alt-right and seeing like how many of them are like into like Kerouac and stuff like that, it's so weird. Yeah. It's so weird because I always thought of that like, oh, if you're into Kerouac, you're cool basically. But now I'm rethinking all of that.
Yeah, right.
So moving towards being a political person, like what was it? What like do you remember like what was it about Occupy that resonated with you? Because Occupy, like it was a movement that went all over the place, and I think now we can say like that its legacy is probably that it introduced the idea of the 99% versus the 1% and that kind of like class stuff. But I remember Occupy just like I going down there and seeing it as kind of like this melange of a mix of a lot of different things, and that's part of what like kind of broke it apart. But what were the things that stood out to you that like made you want to stay and made you want to like not leave?
It's a great question, and I think when I talk about Occupy now, I certainly agree that it was, and I felt it then obviously too, that it was completely mixed. I think a lot of us who were very involved in it just thought it was a complete mess. Mm-hmm. And in the couple years after, I never wanted to talk about it with anyone. It just felt like it was embarrassing and backward and all sorts of stuff. In the moment, I think it was it was really, in part what I said about the idea that people were operating towards each other and towards strangers in a way that I'd never encountered. And that just felt, speaks to what alienation is like in this country and around the world, that being seen as an equal and all of that can have such an effect.
Yeah.
In a sense that I probably can't articulate well, it was also, I knew politics was a thing that existed and that, states did and that determined treaties. And I was studying, whatever international economics and all of this. I knew politics existed in institutionalized form. Occupy made it very clear to me the connection between those institutions and everyday working people. And that was a connection that, it speaks to what we said at the start of this conversation is that history is lost, how we got certain policies, how we, have fought against certain wars, that it's not just bureaucrats and experts and people with international relations degrees that decide those things, that, there is a possibility for any random person off the street to actually be a part of changing those things. And that had just never entered my mind. I mean, that's an embarrassing thing to say, but I just didn't know any of that history. And to see it happening on the local level where this thing I'm involved in all of a sudden has demands on the mayor and has decided that the police, brutality against especially people of color in the city of Boston is unacceptable and actually can be changed. All of that was just completely new. And I thought, wow, what better way to spend my time than doing that?
Yeah.
And so I think that was really it. I mean, in a way, I found, especially in the past year or so that I've worked in media, I actually have a slight advantage from certain people who, I think the common story right now, at least on the U.S. left, is a lot of people who are very invested in liberalism, whether that meant the Democratic Party or the mainstream media, kind of New York Times people, all of that stuff, these columnists and pundits. And so leaving that stuff, there's a lot of baggage and there's a lot of, narrowed horizons. And I just never had that at all because politics, was not a thing I was invested in as an identity or, my understanding of the world, and all of a sudden it was opened up to the extreme. So I became an anarchist, of course, because I had no relation to liberalism or anything like that. So I just thought, oh, why not go for, as full bore as I can. And so yeah, I have lots of learning to do when it comes to, everybody cites these, whatever heroic pundit and columnist that told the story of liberalism, and I never know what their name is, and I have to go read because I've never read those books. And so in that sense, I have catching up to do, but also, it helps in certain ways. But so that was my trajectory. So from Occupy, of course, anarchism, and then eventually socialism.
And what was that path like for you? Like you said, like, did you start reading? Did you start like into the halls of theory, which people get lost in? I mean, I think that
yes,
a lot of people get lost, especially like once you open up the vault to like anarchism and then like Marxism eventually. You can get lost in there. But how did you find your way? Were you like reading other publications and reading, or did you go straight to the Das Kapital, or how did you find those radical sources? 'Cause I say that because it's like it's not. I mean, like we're finding out right now, like the people on the View are like stunned that this stuff exists. Mm-hmm. So how did you find the kind of radical theories as you were moving your way through those waters?
So, I mean, it was completely through other organizers. So I had, again, it's like I wasn't reading any publications, including Jacobin, of course, which is now where I work. That didn't matter. I didn't know it existed. And so it was through, I mean, part of it was that in the Boston left, there is a real overrepresentation of incredibly educated people, right? Which makes sense.
Right.
It's Boston.
Of course.
And so I was finding myself, again, I was 19. I was at the time incredibly broke and very stressed, and all of the things that come with poverty. And I remember me and my then partner, who similarly, he was homeless and a immigrant and had dropped out of school when he was 16. The two of us felt very, completely in over our heads in these circles.
Yeah.
I at least was like, oh, well, I have this BU education, but I'm not learning anything that's relevant there to any of this. So we very much actively got help from everyone around us it started with reading about anarchism, people lending us books. We spent our days in the public library because we had no money to buy any books. We would pick through the $1 book shelves at this great bookstore downtown in Boston that, would put out $1 books, and there were like classics of the left there. And so we would read them together and debate, and I would ask people for new recommendations. And I was really interested in environmentalism at the time. I was studying climate policy. So I was reading these anarchist views of environmentalism and urban planning. And so that's how it went. And I mean, it proceeded on. So I, at one point, lived in a house that was with a bunch of anarchists, and it had a radical library in the basement. It's an amazing thing. It's why I moved into that house.
This is the montage part of the movie where
yes.
where you're like training yourself, reading the books, going bookstore to basement and finding all the anarchist literature.
This is truly, this feels made up when I tell this story, but at one point I had nowhere to live, and I was probably 20 at the time, and my aunt came to town. I was staying on my boyfriend's couch at his parents' house or something, completely not in a great situation. And my aunt, my one kind of bourgeois relative, comes to town, and she gives me her mother's gold necklace as a gift for some reason, as if I would like that sort of thing. And I tell her, Andrea, I'm going to pawn this. You're probably better at pawning things than I am, because I've never done that. Do you want to go help me? And so we go to a store and end up getting $400 for it.
Sweet.
And that was what the rent cost to move into the house. So I could move into so that house had in the basement, something like 10,000 radical texts. And I had, sort of read as much as I could from what I could access at the time. And so this just felt like a new thing. So I moved in and read through, various sections of that library. And by the end of it, I was a socialist.
That's amazing.
And of course, the classic end part is that pretty much made me kicked out of the house because it was an anarchist house. So
Are you
undone,
serious?
I'm very serious. So undone by the socialist literature in the basement.
So you're like, I found this in your house, guys. Like, come on.
Yes, exactly. I'm like reading Lenin, and people start realizing it, and they're giving me anarchist refutations of Lenin that is also in the basement library.
Wow.
But in the end, yes, I end up a socialist.
Yeah, the left gets pretty bitter. I mean, you see,
A bit.
I mean, you see that on Twitter. Is that something
Yes.
you've experienced? I mean, have you had like, and especially I think being like, being a girl on Twitter, like people are savage on there.
Yeah, I think that has very little to do with the left, and
Yeah.
people might think that's a very generous thing to say.
Yeah.
And of course, there is the debates on the left do get very serious and at times very personal. And so, of course, I have that experience. For the record, no bad feelings towards the anarchist folks. That was actually a great experience, despite the political difference that developed.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, the left has, in part, is a reflection of society. We don't have a culture of debate in this country and of how to disagree politically rather than making it personal. So you see that on the left.
Yeah.
The internet stuff, I think, is qualitatively different. I think that is as much about the internet as it is about the left. But that said, yes, I don't think you have to be on the left to experience incredibly disturbing things on the internet.
That's for sure.
If you're at all visible or public.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm more talking about like the kind of history of like contentiousness on the left, and apart from all the kind of like toxicity of the internet and the way we speak to one another on there, there's the left has also like disagreed about some core things about like the role, and it sounds like the role of the state was something that got between you and the anarchists.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, right? In a way, in part, the shorter term reasoning that at least I think is part of the story here is the left has been marginal in this country for a long time now.
Yeah.
And what comes with that is that your political engagement and your organizing work becomes very wrapped up with your identity. And when that's the case and your friends are your, comrades and vice versa, and that's your whole life, it's a recipe for, as soon as a disagreement comes up, it really gets very intense, and it feels like, your life is ending if you're in disagreement with the people that are your social circle, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's a huge part of this stuff. And actually, what's really exciting about this current moment is the left is becoming big enough that that's really not happening as much. I mean, it's still happening, but there's work to be done, and there are other debates to be had that are clearly not about, I dislike you as a person, or in our 10-person group, I disagree with you. And so it gets very venomous. Now these debates are huge.
Yeah.
And so I think that
they're everywhere. They're
helps.
on The View.
They're on The View. That's correct. Yeah.
That's the metric.
That said, this is a very, charitable interpretation of what left culture is like. I mean, people do still, I think we're not going to have a pretty and perfect left overnight.
No,
and so
never.
Those debates still, of course, happen. And my hope is that something like DSA helps in fostering a slightly healthier culture, in that there are all of us, myself included, are learning how to work with people we disagree with. That's part of what DSA is, by being a big tent, and how to disagree, politically, and how to maintain those working relationships with people, and kind of separate the personal whatever problems or beef from the project at hand.
Yeah, and so what is that project? If you had to describe what the DSA is up to, I mean, I assume it's like, I guess my main question is kind of like what, because I don't know a whole lot about the DSA. I know a little bit, but like, what is the attitude towards the Democratic Party? Is it like, let's destroy and take over the Democratic Party? Because it seems like the Democratic Party has this like machine, right? And that's how they've won elections for so long. And so it's a question of like how effective right now that machine actually is. But how does the DSA, like, how do we take over that machine, or is that even the plan?
So that is one thing where I very much speak on my own behalf rather than DSA's.
Sure.
I mean, all these things, I never speak on DSA's behalf, but DSA is, I mean, as you're probably aware, is a completely new organization qualitatively than what it was 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It has a history, and that history is one of realignment, right? So taking over the Democratic Party, it was kind of the goal from the founders on. DSA is now a completely different organization, and its long-term goals and vision are totally to be determined in a certain sense. That said, so the debate around the Democratic Party is a very lively one within DSA. I come in as my personal view on it is both that realignment is not the goal. The goal is not to take over the Democratic Party. And actually, I would say that may be the median perspective at this point. I think generally people do not want to do that in DSA. That's not the long-term goal. What is being done very frequently right now is what's seen as like using the Democratic Party. Right. So using the ballot line, running on the ballot line to both build the capacity of the organization and to agitate and bring people into the left, as well as, gain. I mean, I think the capacity argument is really powerful right now, which is we need to know how we need to both win, because that is crucial for both bringing people to the left that sort of thought the left was marginal, and also learning how to run campaigns and build power. So I think that's a strong argument. I think a lot of people in DSA would like to break from the Democratic Party. In part, that looks like, for example, we've had candidates run as Green Party candidates. So we had a guy named Jabari Brisport run in Brooklyn and on the Green Party ballot line, and he got a remarkable percent of the vote. I can't remember. I think it was about a third of the vote, and that's again in Brooklyn, which is dominated by the Democratic Party machine. So it's a pretty impressive, example of what it looks like if you reject the Democratic Party, that you actually can still, do what we're trying to do, which is build capacity and run strong campaigns. I think the question to be determined is really what wins out within DSA. For right now, I think there's a deferral of that ultimate question because we're just we're not big enough to, whether it's form a party, break from the Democrats, whatever you want to call it. So right now, what we're doing seems to be working really well, which is judging what a place looks like. It looks different in New York, this strategy, than it does in Chicago, than it does in Idaho, and just doing what makes sense in that place, whether it's getting one of our members to run on the Democratic Party line, whether it's supporting a Green who is not in DSA, all that stuff is very much being determined, as a case-by-case basis, I think. But it's an open debate, for sure, what the goal is.
Yeah, it just makes me wonder a bit about kind of like what the overall like long-term strategy is and how we kind of navigate these waters. Do you worry about I guess the number one issue that radicals and leftists always worry about when they start like messing with the electoral system and starting to win elections is like worrying about like being co-opted or being the message being taken by the Democratic Party just to win elections. Like, I don't know. Yeah. Like I saw Kirsten Gillibrand this morning. She's talking about she's all of a sudden like wearing a Che Guevara shirt and like talking about like abolish ICE and stuff like that. And I'm like, is she gonna just take our language and run with it? Do you worry about that? And is it how do we stop that?
So so the part that I don't worry about is, in a sense, because we know that's what happens. Throughout history, we know that politicians will do whatever they can to co-opt the left's demands. They will make sure that it has their stamp on it, that the legislation is not as radical as it could be. That's a sign of a threat, right? That they feel compelled to do that. So that's to be expected. It's not a concern. What is concerning is that the effect that can have on, say, DSA membership or people who are being radicalized generally, throughout the United States. So I used to feel very confident on this question. I agreed with sort of the line that you may have heard of the Democratic Party is the graveyard of social movements.
Right.
They will, and I kind of still agree with that. Actually, I would say I do agree with that. What's become unclear, and this is in part the Bernie Sanders lesson and now Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's lesson, is that may be the case, but is there an advantage to engaging with that stuff strategically and, for a purpose that we decide to build our capacity and to build our strength. Will people get confused by seeing the Democratic Party try to get in front of these demands? Will they decide that the Democratic Party is the answer to this stuff rather than social movements or labor movements? I think that's very unclear. That said, again, as I mentioned earlier, anything, I don't write about electoral politics. That, to me, is not where power lies. Power lies in the labor movement and the social movements around it.
Yeah.
And so, there's, of course, media cares about electoral politics in a way that distorts, I think, that order of priorities here.
Sure. Yep.
And so in that sense, what we can do is, we're going to run these electoral campaigns. We're going to participate in that stuff. I think that makes sense. And it's exciting to see an organization try something new that's on the left. But we're also running lots of campaigns, both within unions, within communities, around immigrant, all these things that we're going to keep building working class power, and the politicians can do as they please.
Well, can you talk a little bit about that? You mentioned you just said how the labor movement is kind of the heart of it, and the social movements that are around it. What do you mean by that? What are the social movements around labor?
So I think I just mean social movements. So I view the labor movement in a broader definition, which is working class people self-organizing. So that doesn't just mean unions.
Right.
So I tend to.
Well, it can't. I mean, it can't just mean unions. Right. I mean, we either completely abandon the union model or rebuild it, because the number of people working class people who are in unions is pretty small, right?
Yes. So it's very small. And, I think this is part of what's very concerning about this moment is we have a strong, rising, growing, confident left, and we have an accelerated war on unions. So, in part, this is an argument around, I've written this is what I wrote in the Washington Post, is that labor and working class power is not going to, our prospects for working class power rise and fall with rank and file organizing. Often that looks like organizing new unions or reform movements within unions. Sometimes it looks like things completely outside of organized labor. So it could look like, whether it's the organizing against police brutality, whether it's organizing against ICE, it's working class people beginning to recognize the story I described at the start of this interview, which is politics is not a thing that happens outside of regular working people. It actually, we're the root of that power. And so I think building those capacities is really important. It's very concerning. I mean, I don't know how much you know about the history of the American labor movement, but unions very much adopted, during, it's debate when this happened, but business unionism, this idea that labor is in a partnership with management, that a union exists to represent its particular members rather than to fight for the working class. All of that is just the dominant conception of what a union is now.
Right.
And that could work for a couple, for a decade or two when unions were a significant portion of the working class. That doesn't work anymore. That looks like a interest group consciousness that represents 7% of people. It's just not enough to convince anyone to do anything. You just, even on a transactional political logic, you're not a power player anymore. And so that's just a failing strategy.
Right.
There's the political argument that is also just that's not how we win power, that unions are vehicles for working class, development and consciousness and organization, and that operating as if they are just a narrow interest group itself is a problem and, restricts as much as it gains. Obviously, I agree with that perspective. And so I recently have written about, unions winning when rank and file workers take militant action like strikes and actually fight on behalf of the broader working class, which we've seen recently in the teachers' strikes.
Yeah.
We've seen it, not ancient history. I mean, this stuff does happen still. And I mean, the Chicago Teachers Union, its strike a few years ago on behalf of not just its members, but, the working class that is completely under attack in Chicago. I mean, schools were being closed. It was incredibly, it was disproportionately affecting people of color. And so when they went out on strike, even with if they're, if leadership in teachers unions aren't interested in it, the members themselves said, no, we are well placed, and we know that our power here gives us the chance to actually win things, not just for ourselves, but for everybody in our communities. And they actually won, that's how you win mass public support, right? Which is what you need if unions are just a single digit percentage of the population. Now you have to convince the public to be on your side.
Yeah.
And so, to me, that's the answer to these things.
I wanted to ask you about kind of something else. That's when you talk about social movements that are happening in our era. We've had this kind of like I don't know if you would call this like a what wave of feminism you would call this, like maybe if people will eventually call this like hashtag Me Too movement and the stuff that's like kind of emerging around it. I don't know if people will refer to that as a fourth wave or something like that, but in terms of feminism, like how does that fit? I know you've written about it a little bit, but how does that fit? How does that fit into the larger kind of like awakening that we're seeing here?
That's a huge question.
I know. I'm sorry.
So yeah, no, it's okay. So yes, I've written a lot about the Me Too, whether you want to call it a movement, phenomenon, moment, whatever, connecting it explicitly to what it looks like for working class life to get worse.
Yeah.
And so I don't see it as removed. I mean, lots of these teachers that I've, personally spoken to, a lot of them are, especially the West Virginia teachers are people that are very close to the left, very active, involved socialists. Their opinion is, well, you have, Me Too is a place where we start talking about our working conditions.
Yeah.
And we start realizing that our working conditions actually suck and we should do something about it. And teachers, it was women leading those strikes. And so these are the same, even though these are not the same issue or the demands aren't connected explicitly or something like that. I mean, this is how consciousness works, right? Is like we experience stuff. And so when we experience this widespread kind of politicization around what it's like to be a woman in America, even if it started by rich women in Hollywood or something like that, it actually has an effect on people. And so I think that's a lot of people draw these lines around, Occupy happens, and then we see Black Lives Matter happen, and there's the Sanders campaign, and we sometimes forget that most of us went through each of those things, right? So we start experiencing again and again. And the broader public, goes to a march for Occupy, and then a couple years later is more likely to get involved with the police brutality, protests. And so I think these things build on each other. But it's a big question what Me Too actually materializes as. Certainly it has spurred union organizing campaigns. It has done, certain things that I think are really important.
Yeah, I agree, I think you're right. The kind of like mapping the material kind of victories of something like Me Too is tricky and maybe not even necessary. It's more kind of like a cultural phenomenon, and it's really hard to hard to quantify that. But like, I don't know if you've ever seen this. It's actually, the whole film is on YouTube. It's a documentary called "With Babies and Banners: the Women's Emergency Brigade," and it's literally about the women who were the wives of the men who went on strike during the Flint, Michigan sit-down strike in 1936. And it interviews all these women who like were part of the union and were basically like played this really important role in not only like protecting physically their husbands and brothers that were in the factory, occupying the factory, but they ran restaurants and they ran food supplies and they had security. It was almost like Occupy. It was like working people on the bottom of the economic ladder, like creating an army that defeated this huge corporation. So when I think about anyway, the film is like an hour long, and it like makes a lot of the same points that you're making there. That like this stuff about Me Too, feminism, the kind of like general feeling that Me Too has created, that there's we have to confront figures of authority, patriarchal figures of authority. I think all that's really important. Yeah, and that's not. And even though I generally try to take the the really useful currents and whatnot from within any political movement that's happening. I think something that we've seen with Me Too that is a real concern
is that because we don't have a militant feminist movement in this country. We have nonprofits, we have liberal feminism,
right?
And it's not to say we don't have radical feminists. We obviously have, I'm a socialist feminist. Obviously, there are organizations that are actively of that tradition, but we don't have a very visible fighting feminist movement in the way that we had even, in the last. And so what that looks like is, you have this incredible energy around Me Too. So many people, obviously mostly women, but just so many people wanted to change this thing that everyone agreed about. It was terrible. It's bad that every woman they know seems to have experienced really awful things, whether in their work life or elsewhere. And yet there was nowhere really for people to go.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that speaks to, why, whether it's political organization or whatever, I think it's generally political organization, when you don't have that infrastructure of an organized left that can really lead that energy and develop it and take people, whether it's to the, out onto the streets or to demand certain changes, it dissipates. And so I think we're seeing that in some respect, that what starts as an individualized story, I'm a woman, I've experienced these things. You talk to your coworkers, you realize they've experienced things. Often there's nowhere to go after that.
Right.
And so it's sort of, it's a real missed opportunity, I think, for, and it speaks to why left organizations and whatnot should be really preparing themselves to actually figure out a way to fight back against, incredibly anti-feminist policies in this country and the experiences of working class women. Because, in New York, there are a couple organizations that do really good feminist work. There's organizations that fight against abortion restrictions and for reproductive rights. And they were making a point to really kind of relate what a lack of autonomy means, around Me Too to what it means for reproductive rights. But that kind of narrative, just there wasn't enough organized people making that connection to really lead that energy to somewhere where we can affect actual change.
That's such a great point. Yeah, thank you for making it, because to me, it's the idea that, you're right. There's all this energy that people have, when they're reading these things on the internet. It's almost like they go to the internet. If something happens, you go to the internet instead of right. And that just speaks to our lack of institutional power. That there should be if I have a Me Too issue in my life and I'm figuring out that other people do as well, then there should be a place that seems the obvious place to go. And it seems like if the left could be that place, there's extraordinary power in that.
Yeah. And it's also why I believe, it's hard to do in practice because, again, the left continues to really be lacking in both people and resources and time and all these things. But it's why I think everyone who's, certainly a socialist should be engaging with movements like the Me Too stuff. And I remember, sort of resenting, I saw some people kind of dismiss it as imperfect because it's individualized and it's really heavily reliant on social media and didn't start with rich people. And, the left should do what we can do to broaden class politics in this country. And that's on us to do. No movement in, when we have no class politics, in our discourse and in our history that anybody learns, we're never going to see a movement emerge that's just naturally and organically, the version of feminism or the version of class politics that we want.
Right.
Right. And so, yes, that is why I bothered writing, a number of stories, not because I just love talking about sexual harassment or something.
Right.
Yeah.
But it fits into the matrix of all the politics we're talking about. And I don't know if hearing you talk about it, it makes me think about this book. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's by a sociologist called Anne Enke. It's called Finding the Movement. I always talk about this book. I've brought it up a million times. Because I haven't read it. What's it about? So it's about feminist institutions in the 1970s in the United States, like softball leagues and bookstores and little physical institutions that feminists built. And it's kind of the whole introduction is exactly what you're talking about. This kind of idea that many people knew, including many women who were interested in the topic, and were experiencing these issues in their lives. Many people knew that feminism existed and it was around. And it was this powerful thing, and you saw it in magazines and on the cover of Time, but they didn't know where to go, and literally how, where do I literally find the movement? Where do I write a postcard to somebody? Especially without the internet. there's like this need for like a physical institution, but it's just making me think about, how there are all these like kind of latent forces, cultural forces, social forces, etc., like kind of sitting there in the American body politic, and the left would be smart to kind of start creating places where those energies can be.
Yeah, and I think, to give the left, that's a nebulous term. It's very hard to define the left in a country as large as this. But there are, of course, many organizations and people and whatnot that do try to create those spaces. And and of course, I even just talking about the left as if it's separate from, the broader public makes no sense anymore.
Right.
And so, it was really even a thing like Me Too, which may end up being this sort of like epiphenomenon that, maybe can't affect certain changes. There are people who, like I said, either organize unions, end up leading militant workplace actions, did challenge people. All of that happened, right? So it's constantly ongoing, but organizing that energy, I think, that takes intentional work.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a really useful lesson for all of us to keep looking at and keep engaging with as a movement.
Yeah, especially when you have like neoliberal feminism and like the Democratic Party is going to try to steal that and take, to turn Me Too into something for, something that along the lines of like the Hillary Clinton kind of campaign. And that stuff is like really depressing.
Yeah.
And it speaks to, again, the need to like create some sort of alternative institution that says like, no, this is where that energy goes. It seems like a lot of work to do.
It is, yes. Like I said, lots of work in the current moment for sure. But at least, thank God, we have seemingly more people than ever really trying to engage with building a left in this country again.
It's an exciting moment. We're in the battle. Alex Press, thank you so much for speaking with me.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Okay, I want to thank my guest, Alex Press. I had a great time talking with her. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. You can find so much more Nostalgia Trap stuff at nostalgiatrap.com. And like I said, we have a really crazy bonus episode up this week. That's me and Justin trying to unpack hip-hop and Trump and what it all means. So if that is of any interest to you, or you just want to support the show, go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap and sign up for the show, and you'll get access to all that bonus material. Okay, thanks so much. I appreciate your listening to the show. Take care. Bye-bye.